Hey guys, how you doing today? If you hear any snacking or smirking in the background, my dog's just eating something, and I suspect when he's done, he'll start snurfling about because he's a little sweetie. But outside of that, today I want to talk about wage slavery and its reality and its existence. Touch on its history a little bit. Wage slavery has existed in capitalism since its beginning. It is how capitalism distributes goods. Very simply stated, wage slavery is that your food and shelter is withheld from you unless you sell yourselves into a labor market. And of course, the people who are looking to buy labor are the owners of the society. And the people who have to sell their labor, of course, are the wage slaves. The great lie that's going around now, especially in conservative circles, is that everyone is engaging in contracts on a voluntary basis. That if I sell myself to an owner, I'm doing so voluntarily. This, of course, is extremely dishonest and delusional. The idea that, and it's typically people who are in the ownership class, people who have earned or who have been given enormous inheritances and things like this, who buy into this ridiculous idea. The wage slave system, right, after the Civil War, right, the chattel slavery system was abolished, but many of the black slaves found themselves in the position that, oh, well, now we're free, but it turns out that what free meant was we were free to sell ourselves back into wage slavery, which is how capitalism was working for everyone else. And so it earned them a deal of equality in that sense, in that poor white folk were also engaging in this wage slavery. And certainly chattel slavery is a much worse system in terms of the rights of the individual, right? Like an owner can literally, like they were forcing black slaves to fight to the death, right? Like Quentin Tarantino's Django did not overstate that. So there are civil liberty issues, of course, that chattel slavery is a worse system, but the chattel slavers themselves during the Civil War argued that chattel slavery was actually a superior system to wage slavery because chattel slavery ensured that food and shelter were distributed to the slave, while wage slavery did not. The chattel slavers insisted that should labor and industry shift in such a way that the labor of the slave is not needed, then because we own the slave, because the slave is considered our property, we still have to look out for the shelter and food of the chattel slave. Whereas the wage slaver will simply lay their slave off and force them to go find other work elsewhere to another owner. And it's in this way, and that has actually borne out that we as wage slaves are only free to in regards to finding our own owner, right? And if we don't like the owner that we work for, then we are free to go find another owner. But they're all members of the ownership class, and so that relationship itself is a significant problem that I seek to ameliorate in our society. And others have, of course, before. I think it's extremely telling. I mean, we've been talking about the Civil War and chattel slavery, so I think it's worth talking about Martin Luther King, right? Martin Luther King was permitted to do what he wanted. He was permitted to go around the United States and organize poor black people on issues of equality. This was more or less permitted simply because his argument was one that was strictly cultural, that white people and black people needed to find a way to live together. Of course, Malcolm X disagreed with this proposition, which is why Malcolm X is painted as a far more radical figure. But Malcolm X understood more than Martin Luther King understood that the issue was not cultural, that the issue was economic. And this is why eventually Martin Luther King does shift and does start to change the way he speaks about issues of race relations in the United States, which ultimately is why he is assassinated by the United States government. That's not hyperbolic. That's not a conspiracy theory. That is the conclusion of the investigation of his assassination by the court system in the United States, that he was assassinated by the United States government. And it happens because he changes the way he speaks about relationships and the way that we need to move forward as a society from being strictly cultural. We need to be nicer to each other, right? That individual people need to find ways forward, and he shifts from that into economic issues, where he begins to support a basic income. He begins to recognize that the core issue that the society is facing, while also cultural, but is more importantly an economic system. And that economic system is wage slavery. And once he began to recognize this and speak openly about its solution, then that's when he becomes a target from the United States government and is ultimately assassinated. Because it cannot become commonly understood that the system of wage slavery has an easy solution. It can't become commonly understood that something like the basic income, which we know is easy to enact, which we know is not an issue that takes a lot of time or effort to do, which we know solves the problem of poverty, which we know ameliorates a lot of stress in the society, which we know does not turn people into lazy welfare bums, right? The Finland experiment proved that explicitly. We know what the solution is, and now I do think it's time to more specifically talk about and openly talk about what the problem is. That capitalism has done a very good job. I don't think capitalism does a good job at anything. I think that capitalism is a waste of humanity's time across the board. But it does do one thing very well, which is propagandize. Its propaganda is the best propaganda that humanity has ever created. Right? There's a wonderful comic called Existential Comics that I look at. It's not a comic. It's just a fellow. He's a philosopher, really. And he put up an interesting tweet where he says, I don't want to ever I'm not going to tolerate anyone ever telling me that America is not the most heavily propagandized country on the planet. North Koreans may die for their great leader, but Americans will apparently die for, like, Dairy Queen being open. And that's really the truth, that the American propaganda machine has convinced wage slaves that they are operating on equal footing with the ownership class, and that the contracts that they get into with the ownership class are voluntary, which is a lie, right? No one voluntarily sells themselves into a labor market dominated by billionaires. We're doing it for food and shelter. That's explicit, and it should be explicitly stated. And I think that the strongest piece of propaganda because propaganda is most effective when it's normalized and embedded in the society. If propaganda is obvious propaganda, like, think about, like, if you watch Reefer Madness, right? If you go and watch Reefer Madness now, that's hilarious. That is ineffective propaganda. Lots of the anti-communist propaganda is ineffective propaganda. It's childish, right? and you can see it. And the second that you see that it's propaganda, like advertisements, during this period of time, there's like all these advertisements are coming out and basically saying, in these trying times, buy our stuff, right? And lots of people are pointing this out and pointing out the ludicrousness of this, and because they're recognizing that advertisements are propaganda, that's what they are. But if propaganda exists in your society and it's normalized, and everybody accepts it as truth, even if it isn't, then that's the most effective propaganda. Of course, the most effective propaganda is the propaganda that is mainly true and then alters the discourse ever so slightly in a lie. And where I think the society has most propagandized itself in the most effective way and has become normalized is through the language of employer and employee. That previously that would be master and slave, or at least slave and owner, right? And now we don't use that language, right? That language is seen as crass. And if you use that language, then of course the ownership class is going to get in a tizzy and I do declare and all of this kind of nonsense. And will try to paint you as being either hyperbolic or as being incendiary, right? And I mean, I am incendiary, right? I think that we should be incendiary against the ownership class that denies that we're living in a wage slave society. So breaking down that propaganda and making it so that that is no longer normal, that people who use words like employer, employee are delusional. You are not an employer, right? You are an owner. You are not hiring an employee. You are hiring a wage slave. That's the arrangement, and it should be explicitly stated. The wage slaves understand this, and they'll say this to each other in kind of a joking manner, with a tinge of embarrassment, or a tinge of caution, because they don't want to be the person who stands up and declares that what we live in is a wage slave society. This, of course, becomes more and more obvious, right, as more and more power is distributed to less and less people. One of the great contradictions of capitalism, and one of the great consequences of capitalism, is that power and wealth will eventually reach smaller and smaller hands of people, because as more and more less and less people have more and more stuff, they're able to purchase more and more assets, until finally the goods that they produce can no longer be purchased by the society, and so the whole system collapses in on itself, as capitalism is designed to do. Now, if you create something like a basic income, this ameliorates that contradiction, but it also has the side effect of making it so that wage slaves no longer need to sell themselves into wage slavery. The rebuttal to this is, of course, well, who's going to do, who will work? And of course, that's a kind of a thing for a whole other video, but people want to work. They just don't want to work at what billionaires think is valuable, because billionaires think things like enslaving populations is valuable. Billionaires think that maintaining dominance and control is valuable. Billionaires think slavery is valuable. So who cares what they think about any subject, or what job they consider valuable, right? If they think it's valuable, they can work at it themselves. Of course, billionaires don't work. The ownership class rarely works. That's the whole idea. That's the whole point. That's the reason why they want to keep it in place, is because if they had to actually go work at these jobs themselves, then they wouldn't. And so, and it would give lie to their own system. They want you to make their money for them. They don't want to create a better society. They want to maintain their power and control. This could all be ameliorated with a basic income. Of course, our government is enacting, and here's what's going to happen, right? So they've passed the CERB, which is a basic income. because of the nature of the economy, because of how it works in a cycle, right? It goes in a circle. That if you fund a basic income one time annually, it cycles through the tax system and comes back to the government to be redistributed. That's how the child care benefit works. That's how the old age security pension works. Both of those are basic income style programs. And what's going to happen, like the ludicrousness of this, that they're not simply enacting a basic income, is that they're trying to pass off the CERB as a temporary measure during a pandemic. We will be dealing with this pandemic until this time next year, especially because of how the United States has dealt with it. Like, there are places in Canada that are reaching a stable plateau, that have, quote unquote, that have stabilized, so to speak. I'm skeptical of that, of course, but that's a whole other subject. But the States is still on a sharp climb, and there's every indication that it's going to continue in that way, that they're not going to reach a plateau for a long, long time. And of course, we're going to hit a second wave of this, because all it takes is outbreaks here and there suddenly coming out and going through the populace. And of course, as the populace itself relaxes its own restrictions naturally, because people are beginning to realize that sitting on your ass doing nothing is actually extremely difficult to do, then the second wave is inevitable. And so this time next year, this quote-unquote temporary CERB program is going to have been there the entire time, which means that the basic income will have been fully funded. We will be living under a basic income, and to take it away after it has been fully funded already would be more costly than to simply leave it in place. This is something that the capitalist class doesn't want to see. The capitalist class likes slaves. They seek slaves out. That's why they shipped all the manufacturing jobs overseas, is because we were asking for equal treatment, or a treatment that was suitable for a civil society, and they said, no, we prefer slaves. And now, of course, we walked over to China, which was completely willing to sell its society into slavery and then enriched them, and now are beginning to realize why that's a bad thing to have done. And now we're beginning to see, oh, maybe enriching people who are willing to sell their own citizens into slavery has consequences that we were not prepared to deal with. We can get into the China conversation if you like, but the shorthand is that China is kind of revealing itself to be a fascist country. I mean, it's got all the indications. America is right on the cusp. I mean, it has all the signs and indications it could go that way. But doing something like passing a basic income, giving individual people the freedom to begin to explore their own paths, also gives them the freedom to disconnect from the wage slave economy and begin to connect to an economy that is built on voluntary principles. Because we don't exist in an economy that exists in voluntary principles. We exist in an economy that is explicitly built on wage slavery. Okay, I think that's the end of me. This is actually a pretty long video this time. I hope you guys are doing well. If you want me to talk about a subject, just let me know in the comments. And please like and subscribe, share this stuff around. Because we are fighting against wage slavery. We, as Canadians, are on the cusp of passing important legislation that I think is inevitable, that will happen in any case. Because this pandemic is, in my view, a test. This was the planet just giving us the littlest possible test. We have larger issues that are coming down the pipe, and if we waffle and if we pretend like the basic income is not necessary, we can enter a horror state pretty quickly. Yeah, Viva la Revolution, let's do it. Good luck out there.